Hello everyone, I'm pleased to welcome you to this session with George McKibbon. George is a graduate of the Rural Planning and Development Program from a few years ago, and in addition to that, George has spent a lot of his professional career working in the realm of healthy communities. So we're really pleased to have you with us, George. Really excited to hear from you in terms of some of your background and some of your specific interests. George will join us for a number of weeks with different videos, so again, thank you for doing that.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to do this. By way of background, I'll just give you a brief outline. I am a graduate of this program, 85. I'm also a graduate of York University's Environmental Studies program with a Master's in Environmental Studies. I began my planning career in 1974 with the Hamilton Region Conservation Authority as conservation planner. Worked there for about 4.5 years. In 1978, I joined the Niagara Escarpment Commission and helped in the plan's preparation group, preparing the Niagara Escarpment Plan, which was approved in 1985. In the latter few years that I worked there, I did quite a bit of hearing work, environmental assessment hearings, and research. And in 1987, I decided to try my skills in the private sector.
Okay.
So I joined Ecologistics Limited as a senior consultant in land use planning in 1987 and worked there for about 10 years till 1996. During that period of time, I had the opportunity to work with several First Nations communities, primarily in Northern Ontario, primarily with Anishinaabe-Aski Nation, Treaty 9, but also with communities out of Sioux Lookout that were represented by Windigo First Nations Council. Working with First Nations really makes you aware of some of the social and public health issues that are involved. And so that was fairly fundamental. I really went private simply because I had begun working on my own time with First Nations. At that time, the Anishinaabe-Aski Nation had an office in Toronto, and they had that office specifically to become involved with provincial decision-making, where access to resources off reserve were the issue. And I used my skills as in environmental assessment to assist them in organizing and positioning themselves in discussions, negotiations, and one of the outcomes of that was the Musselwhite Agreement, which became a kind of a protocol for subsequent impact benefit agreements. And that particular agreement dealt with many things that would fall into the category of social determinants of public health right now. So that was the introduction. In '96, I left to set up my own practice with a group of other planners and landscape architects in Burlington. We had a kind of a boutique there where clients could come in and they could buy services, planning and design services from us. And I continued some of the work with clients that I developed with Ecologistics, but I also began working with landscape architects a lot more carefully. And that began my sort of work in walkability and cycling. And at the same time, too, having my own practice, I could sort of say I could do volunteer work more easily. And in particular, I started to volunteer with OPPI, Ontario Professional Planners Institute, in the policy committee. And from about 95, around 2000 on. And eventually, in 2006, OPPI decided to create a healthy communities policy. And they asked...
Jump in there for a second, because there's 2 or 3 things you said I think that are really worth repeating.
Okay.
Your work with First Nations, which led to interest in social indicators of health, I think was one, and then working with landscape architecture practitioners, and those 2 or 3 things coming together, it seems like it really contributed to you getting to your interest with the healthy communities with OPPI, and as you've mentioned. Is that a fair summary?
My passion has always been design
Okay.
and integrating research from different areas into that design process. And I don't have the skills of an architect or a landscape architect, but I do have the thought process to begin to think about how to do things. And in particular with Glenn O'Connor, who was the principal of the landscape architecture firm that we worked together with, I began to become involved in that sort of thing. Initially with the Trails Master Plan for the city of Hamilton, but eventually it culminated in a walkability plan for the city of Hamilton. Those plans actually received several design awards as well. So that was kind of reassurance that I was on the right track and was able to proceed. But the volunteer work was both with the city of Hamilton, Clean Air Hamilton, where the concern is air quality and public health, and with OPPI. In 2007, I believe it was, we produced OPPI's Healthy Communities Policy. In 2010, when my term as policy director ended, I joined the Canadian Institute of Planning's Healthy Communities Committee. And we labored there for several years. The first 3 as part of members of the CLASP effort, which gave us access to public health officials and others concerned about walkability and cycling right across the country. So I had access to the design work and the research that they were doing. And we produced several documents which are on CIP's website right now to help planners. But in this year, that work culminated with the Healthy Communities Policy. And that took about a year to produce, involving the membership right across the country and experts both from public health side and planning. You had the opportunity in the summer to be involved in that exercise. And once we got that all together, we presented that to the board, and the board, CIP's board, approved it and released it this November. So that sort of culminates all that work. At the same time, I was able to work, one example of working with public health officials, Trevor Hancock from Vancouver leads a rather eclectic group of people. And I had the good fortune of somehow getting involved with his effort to produce a document on ecological determinants of public health. So I was the lone planner, the lone person who wasn't an academic, working with this group of people from across the country, about 30, 35, various teams. I don't know how I ever fit in it, but it was just incredible to sit at the table and listen to them go back and forth. But we produced this determinants paper as a discussion paper for public health officials right across the country. I consider that to be a major achievement. I didn't contribute a lot. I stood in awe of all these people. But on the other hand, I've kept those relationships up and kept doing a few things, and will do a few things going forward as well.
If you mind, just to summarize, there's, I think, 3 points I've heard there in terms of resources that would be available to students. One of which is the OPPI's release on healthy rural communities, the policy direction that OPPI has established, and there will be materials on the OPPI website. The second of which is the significant work done by the Canadian Institute of Planners, leading most recently to this past summer, 2018, to the release of materials from CIP. And the third, which sounds like a really interesting document, was looking at the ecological determinants of health, and that would be available.
CPHA's website.
Okay, Canadian Public Health Association's website.
You have to do a bit of scooting around to get it, but it's.
What we'll maybe try to do is get a link to that, and we'll put it on the course link to accompany that. So that would be really helpful. So let me just ask you, what do you consider to be a healthy community, maybe to start with, and then why is rural important in all of that?
I want to say, first off, and this is an observation from the work that I've done, most of the work on social determinants and ecological determinants and public health policy is oriented towards a rural setting.
Mm.
So if you take the urban transit from downtown, suburbs, rural area, agricultural, small town, to the natural environment, now it's broken up into much more finer detail.
Mm.
We're at the farm end of that transit, and most of the work, when it comes to design work, is with walkability in particular, is oriented towards urban settings.
Right.
It's not oriented to rural settings. For example, in work that I did for Peel Region Public Health, a task that we had was to inventory all the different walkability tools, scoring tools.
Okay.
And my wife and I, who's a clinical epidemiologist, did most of that work. And we gathered about 50 different tools. Of those 50 different tools, only 2 do a small town in Guelph.
Okay.
And they're very exotic. So they're across the board. Everything tends to be oriented towards an urban setting, and tends to be oriented towards physical objects in that urban setting that can be scored easily using computer algorithms. You don't have much work in the rural area. So the rural area, why it's important is that we really haven't started much there. It's kind of a vacuum right now. It's also a problem, I think, from the point of view that planners tend to look at things. When we look at them, we rely on heuristics that are biased. Representativeness. If you're in Ontario, you look at the PPS 2014, it's all urban, not much rural. And so we have that kind of bias towards the urban area. So we need to set that bias apart and look at the rural area differently and from the fresh. If I were doing that, what I would do was use some concepts that Hannah Arendt put together many years ago. And there's 3 concepts. What an individual needs: labor to deal with the biological realities of living, food, air, water, things like that. I'd look at work from the point of view of what does a mother or a father need to do to support their children or their aging parents in place. And I'd look at associations, action, the things that we do to identify ourselves within the broader community, as a municipality, as a religious organization, as a profession, as a business, how we kind of act out in our corporate relationships. And I begin to think about just how land use could fit into that sort of arena to support those 3 activities, keeping in mind the social determinants and the ecological determinants. I don't know what that form is going to look like going forward, but I've seen glimpses of it from time to time, and I think that that's the way I would sort of approach it. I think it means divorcing ourselves from the way we've traditionally thought and beginning to think a bit differently. I'll have some comments about that later on.
We get into some other topics. This is just part of an introductory session this week. Is there anything else you'd like to say from an introductory perspective? We're going to get into some of the specifics in subsequent videos, but anything else from an introductory perspective?
I do have some, I can put together some list of authors and books that I think are helpful.
Sure, we'll make those available.
Helpful to me. And I can make those available. And I can also kind of brief out some, in point form, some of the answers to the questions that you posed to me. I had done that in part in preparation for this section, but the questions changed a bit. So I'll go back through that. And I think the other thing I want to do is as a kind of a basic starting point is we talk about the ecological determinants, and I'll have something to say about that. We talk about the social determinants in the questions that you've asked of me. You've linked economic. I would kind of also add technology, because I think technology is a huge variable going forward. And I would link technology, social, and economic together under the rubric of social.
Okay, yes.
So it's social determinants and biophysical determinants, ecological determinants.
And key examples of social determinants and key examples of ecological determinants would be things such as?
I think climate change is an obvious, and I would think of it as a kind of forgot the word, kind of a border.
Okay.
And I think of the ecological determinants really as kind of physics. It's the context in which we live, biophysically.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a certain logic to that which is constant. And it's been stable over the past thousands of years.
Mm-hmm.
What we're doing right now is creating instability in that. And that instability kind of filters back into the social determinants in ways that are pretty unpredictable. Social determinants, I would include poverty.
Yes.
And effects on housing, income, available income, and also the ability to deal with some of the changes that are taking place in the ecological determinants, noxious substances that we release, either through everyday activity or through industrial processes, kind of filter through the social determinants in ways that are kind of influenced by your economic ability to handle them or manage them and the like. That's
very helpful. I think it's been a great set of introductory comments that will get us thinking about topics as we move forward, as we start to look at some of the specifics related to healthy rural communities. But thanks very much, George, for those introductory comments. They're very helpful.
Thank you.